In my elementary school years, as a little girl growing up in North Alabama, a lot of people don't know this story. And I would say that they don't, or know these quick stories I'm about to tell you, because it's not something I bottled up, but I've never really talked about it, but I'm not ashamed of it either. See, I was homeless 2 times as a child. My fondest memory of it is that, as weird as it was, the first time I believe I was about 5, 6 years old. So I'd go to school by day. Maybe I wasn't even in elementary school yet when this happened. But I can remember being somewhere else by day, then going at night to a shelter. And I tell y'all, that homeless shelter made the best chocolate pudding ever. And they topped it with whipped cream. You can tell that even if they got the Jello pudding out of the box, they spruced it up some type of way. I like to believe that pudding was homemade in that shelter, because to this day I can find nothing. And I've been all over the world. I won't say all over the world. I've only traveled to 4 countries when I was in the Navy. I can find nothing to replicate the authenticity of that taste. I saw that as an adventure. I love sleeping on the floor under the blanket with my siblings, who they're not going to remember that because they were so young, but because I was the oldest, I remember my mom's stress. And sometimes she'd just sit and let me eat unlimited amounts of pudding. I bet she doesn't even remember this story. I knew I was homeless. I knew something was wrong because I didn't have my own bed. But it just felt like a big adventure to me. The second story, I had to been no more than between 7 to 8 years old. And somehow we couldn't get a roof over our head again. Of course, she was still a single mom, and she worked at a convenience store. And I can remember her anxiety and not knowing until I overheard a conversation that a weird man would come in the store and watch her at night. You got to remember, back in the 1980s, there weren't a lot of cameras around like there are now. So when you took a job at a convenience store, it was considered dangerous, because somebody could come in there and do something to you, even kill you. And they didn't have the DNA testing back then to prove or disprove who may have done it. So that person could do it and get by with it for years. There was a night when she had skipped a shift and stayed with us in the hotel room. Because by this time we stayed in the hotel, she would bring us packets of this candy that I'm so happy is still around, called Razzles. If you lived in that time, you know what those were. I was in love with those, and I think she liked to see my face light up when she gave me that candy. She switched her shift that night, and the creepy guy who had been watching the store finally went in, and I think she switched with another woman, and he overpowered and killed her. I think this guy was caught like the same day or the next day, within hours, because it happened late at night. And after that, it wasn't worth it going back to that store. I treated both of those being homeless situations as an adventure, because to me it was. But I still knew my mom was stressed out, and I still had the sense enough to know that I was poor and that I didn't have anything. I grew up throughout the years assisting the homeless in ways that I won't go into, because I don't think when you're helping someone you should be braggadocious. And I feel now, looking back, and particularly at this story here, that situation is the reason that I have a little compassion for the homeless. Now, we're going to address the negative stuff first. Okay, before I get into this, I understand someone listening. If you're breaking and entering to people's business to get a few bucks because you're homeless and you're a drug addict, you're still committing a crime. I understand the people who've gotten on camera boasting about how they get certain amount of money a month for being homeless. And they boast about it while they're able-bodied and can get a job. I'm not saying that there aren't lawbreakers and bad apples. I am saying that there should be a little more compassion for the homeless. But our compassion shouldn't be such that we are reckless with it. This will upset people, and if you're a homeless advocate and I offend you, I apologize in advance. See, here in Seattle, we have something called 1011 East Lake, if it still exists. And it outraged locals at the time because it was a set of apartments with like a little storefront on the bottom where alcoholics could go and get off the street, live there, and be subsidized free alcohol to a degree. And their apartment rent was triple or quadruply lower than the apartment rents of standard people living in Seattle at the time. I don't know if 1011 East Lake still exists. I didn't look it up for this video. And they get to sit and drink, and they're like, well, if we give them subsidized apartments, which at the time were $150 a month, I know they were under $200. It'll heal their addiction. It'll keep the streets clean. And it felt like they were incentivizing people to be functioning alcoholics at the expense of taxpayers. This is the thing about what's going on in San Francisco. Some taxpayers, or most taxpayers, did not know this program was going on. Can you imagine your city having a program where, and I'm not judgmental, I just want to get different perspectives of this, where nurses are allowed to go and serve alcohol to the homeless who are alcoholics and treat them as patients 2 to 3, several times a day. I'll say several times a day, because that's what's happening in this story right here. And the argument made by people who are proponents of this program is if the nurses are serving it to them. They didn't say registered, they just said nurses, but we can assume they're registered nurses. Because they're homeless and they have this issue, that the nurse is serving them, because they give them checkups before they serve them to determine their alcohol, how much alcohol they should get and all of that. They argue that this has lowered the visits to the emergency room. And since I'm being transparent, according to this article, emergency visits due to alcoholism through the homelessness has dropped in this city 70%. So you could say this is working. But is it ethical to start a program like this without going through proper legislation? Because some are arguing that they didn't know that this program existed. And even this city's, I think it's San Francisco, this city's sorry mayor, which I don't really care for sometimes. Even London Breed, I think that's her name, made a statement that she don't think that this is as effective as the proponents think it is. Here are my thoughts. You can't avoid that 70%. Because if that number is true, don't you think the taxpayers deserve to know the stats on that? And see, that raises another issue, ethical issue, because you're not necessarily supposed to know someone's physical health information, what's called PHI. This is how they're able to draw the line between this. Because I was homeless myself, I understand our need to help homeless people. I understand our need to make things better for them because we live in one of the most abundant countries in the world. So how can this many people be getting evicted? How can this many people be hungry right now? How can this many people, like our veterans, be addicted and no one's helping them? I stopped short of supporting giving $5 million a year to give people alcohol who are struggling with alcohol. As a person who grew up homeless myself, I understand the struggle. And because I was the eldest child, I understand watching your parent be stressed over it. But I just don't think that this is the way to take care of it. I can also speak on this a little bit because, like I said, I live an hour from Seattle, and they had apartments on something called 1011 Eastlake that did the same, and then gave them subsidized apartments for under $200 a month when people who are working doing the legitimate thing and were still poised to have to go on the streets were having to go bust their butt and work for the same thing. I'm an advocate for homeless people because I was homeless several times as a kid. But where do we draw the line between helping them and making things worse?